On behalf of the trustees, I welcome you to the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. Special welcome this evening to our distinguished panel, Professor John Weaver of York College and Daniel Kochis, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute think tank. I'm Roy Gutman, the president and CEO of the Baltimore Council. Tonight we focus on the US role in NATO and ask the question, quo vadis? Where is NATO going? Where is the US going? Where is the relationship going? NATO just turned 75 years old. It has 32 members. Finland and Sweden joined after Russia invaded the Ukraine. It may be the world's most enduring and successful alliance, as it's been called, but American leadership itself is under challenge in the American presidential election. Candidate Trump has said that he would abandon NATO. He told a top European official in 2020, "You need to understand that if Europe is under attack, we will never come to help you and to support you. And by the way, NATO is dead, and we will leave. We will quit NATO." That wasn't said in public, but it came out just in the last year. Candidate Harris, by comparison, is committed to the alliance and warns against isolating ourselves from the world, as she said it, quote unquote. So the two have fundamentally different views on the war in Ukraine, which is one of the biggest tests of NATO in its history. In the words of The Economist, Mr. Trump's words suggest that he wants to sell out Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. Those are The Economist's words. His running mate, J.D. Vance, puts it this way: "I really don't care about what happens in Ukraine, one way or the other." Vice President Harris said that for Ukraine to give up territory, on the other hand, is a formula for surrender, which she called dangerous and unacceptable. Now, their words are very different, but the question is this just rhetoric? Or does each side really have a plan? Is it a real plan? And are their plans really that different? At the same time, NATO itself, like any institution, may need change. It needs to be looked at. And likewise, its relationship with the leading power, the United States. Professor John Michael Weaver is an associate professor of intelligence analysis at York College in Pennsylvania. He is the author of NATO in Contemporary Times: Purpose, Relevance, and Future, which was published in 2021, and other works on cybersecurity and intelligence. Daniel Kochis, before moving to the Hudson Institute, was the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he led Europe analysis and wrote the chapter on Europe for Heritage's Index of US military strength. We've asked each to speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. Why don't we start with Daniel Kochis and just ask the basic question: will US relations with NATO change if former President Trump or if Vice President Harris is elected? And what will happen to US policy towards Ukraine? Daniel, over to you.
For me, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not only sort of the foundation for US security, but also for global security. And so I think that we've seen a number of issues recently where you have this sort of third block, which isn't aligned with either the sort of Western world, it isn't aligned with the sort of autocrats, that's sitting somewhere in the middle. But they're very keen to not live in a world where Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping is making the rules, and so they're tending to hem towards the Western side. And so I think that the ability of NATO and the United States to be able to pull those countries, India, Colombia, a number of others, in that direction, I think is going to be really useful in terms of the sort of world that we live in moving forward. Roy has asked me to focus on where we are as a NATO alliance in the present. It reminds me a bit of the Tale of Two Cities. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. In the one sense, it's given the war in Ukraine has given NATO unity and purpose in a way that we haven't had in some time. And I know that Dr. Weaver will discuss this in his remarks, but The alliance, I think, in many ways, is more politically united than it has been in some time. Uh, at the same time, I think we live in a moment of real peril, both in terms of, I think, a real potential for larger scale war on the continent of Europe, but also in terms of potential fracturing in terms of the transatlantic relationship moving forward. So I think that the three key challenges that NATO is facing right now, one that Roy touched on in his opening remarks, and that is, of course, the outcome of the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine, namely ensuring that Russia is dealt a strategic loss rather than merely settling for a tactical pause, which I think makes further renewed aggression much more likely down the line. Second, does the US and its allies individually and collectively have the will to rebuild the sort of capabilities that'll help create lasting deterrence? And finally, can NATO effectively respond to the sort of hybrid gray zone aggressions that are beginning to reach a crescendo? And I'll try to weave in some thoughts on the sort of presidential election and what that can mean in terms of US policy. So we have the ongoing war in Ukraine now. It's been going on for 2.5 years. We're in a stalemate situation by and large. I'm not especially bullish as to where the Ukrainians are at the moment. The Russians have been able to take back about half of the Kursk region that the Ukrainians captured just a month or two ago. And of course, Ukraine is dealing a bit with manpower issues, with issues around equipping their soldiers in the field. And the Russians, I think, are pretty invested in continuing to grind this war out. You've seen this with their war economy. They're basically mortgaging their future economic competitiveness for producing munitions and war material in the present day. The big news this week was that the North Koreans, which are already supplying half of the artillery shells being used by the Russians in Ukraine, have sent maybe up to 10,000 troops to assist the Russians with their operations inside Ukraine. So I think that, this just shows you that the autocracies of the world, the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, and the Iranians, are working together today in a way that would have been almost unfathomable, I think, even just a few years ago. And there are so many examples of the interchanges and the connections that have been growing between these countries. So for me, the idea that the US would give up its greatest advantage, its collection of alliances, it really centered in particular upon NATO, is pretty astounding. You think about the importance of Europe for the US economic competitiveness. 48 states out of 50 trade more with Europe than with China. Over 60% of our FDI, or foreign direct investment, comes from Europe, and vice versa, which is flowing out of the United States. So really, the prosperity of the US really rests upon this relationship, and that is built in large part upon NATO and the sort of security guarantees here. If anything, I think the Ukraine war has really shown that there isn't any more sort of a rear area for a war. And so I think that there is real potential for this to expand if the Russians come away feeling that they are successful in the way that they've been able to challenge NATO. So the first question I think that is going to face an incoming U.S. administration is in terms of Ukraine and what to do about this. My view is that either candidate is going to be very keen on trying to push for some kind of negotiated settlement early on. The Trump administration has been very forthright in their insistence that they could bring everyone to the table and get a deal. I'm a lot less convinced about the possibility of getting a deal. I do think that they could probably force the Ukrainians to the table by withholding further aid. I think the Russians would see some usefulness in maybe going through the motions of getting to the table. I think that the Harris administration is probably similarly quite interested in seeing this conflict being put in the rearview mirror. So I wouldn't be entirely surprised if there's a similar effort under President Harris for some kind of negotiations. I think the question becomes, what are the likelihood of success of those negotiations? I think the likelihood is quite low. The Russians, I think, view themselves as on the front foot. They're retaking bits and pieces of territory with wave assaults. And I think that they believe that they can sort of outlast the West, our collective ability to both supply Ukraine and to keep our publics largely content with our involvement inside Ukraine. So I don't think that they really feel that there's any huge need to come up with a settlement. So I would suspect that the Russians would go through the motions, but never actually agree to some kind of negotiated settlement, or would come in with such ambitions in terms of where their starting point would be that it wouldn't be anything that the West could accept. So then the question, I think, becomes what happens, how keen is the United States in getting a deal? And I think that is quite a bit of an open question. If you look at the way that the U.S. Negotiated with Iran, I think that it was very keen on getting into an agreement, regardless of the cost or whether or not it was a good agreement. So I worry a bit about that with the Harris administration. I think a Trump administration, it could go either way. You could see them very keen on getting this conflict over, and so being willing to sell out the Ukrainians and agree to not have Ukraine inside NATO and give the Russians territory. I think you could also have the potential outcome where the Trump administration feels betrayed by Putin, and maybe goes back to the drawing board and says, we're actually going to help the Ukrainians even further and give them additional equipment because this is getting nowhere. So I think two potential outcomes there. But by and large, the Ukrainians are going to continue to fight, whether or not they have US aid. The Europeans are pretty committed to continuing to supply them. But I think that either administration that goes into this and either forces some kind of negotiation, which is going to be seen as a strategic win for the Russians, is probably just inviting further aggression against either Ukraine once again or against a NATO member state down the line. But also, I can't see that an American president's going to want to come in and own the sort of disaster that a capitulation by Ukraine or a withholding of US aid would entail in terms of humanitarian cost, in terms of territory being lost. That is a real stain, I think, on any administration, and so I think that is maybe a bit of a holding back of where of the parameters of what a future U.S. administration could do. I think with Harris, in many ways, you kind of know what you're getting. I think it would be very similar in terms of the Biden administration. They would be rhetorically very supportive of NATO and Ukraine. I do think that they would continue to try to support them with material and economic assistance. That, of course, is going to rely in large part upon Congress and the makeup of Congress. So there are some challenges there. I anticipate that they would come into office with much of the same reticence that the Biden administration officials have in terms of escalation, which I think has caged in a bit the Ukrainians in terms of their ability to succeed on the ground. The Trump administration, of course, with all things, is a bit more of an open book. We're not quite sure what you're going to get. I think for most people would agree that the last time around, the rhetoric in terms of U.S. alliances was pretty horrible. But what actually happened in terms of U.S. engagement, in terms of U.S. equipment, was actually pretty good. And so I do think that there's a possibility that some of this from the campaign is a bit rhetorical, but I also think that there is a possibility that the former president means what he says. So I would look a bit to what the makeup of the administration is. Of course, Vance is one voice. He had a very different opinion about a lot of these matters a few years ago than he does now. But I would be very keen if Trump wins again to see some of the other people that he brings in his administration in terms of if it is a more isolationist crowd. I think you sort of know where things are going. If he brings in people like Pompeo, who are a bit more engaged and want to see the U.S. a bit more engaged, then I think it's going to be much more of a mixed bag in terms of where the administration ends up. So the second challenge that I would point to is this capacity question, and this is one I think that either administration is going to face, and it's a very, very difficult one in terms of rebuilding the U.S. defense industrial base. It has atrophied pretty significantly. It's obviously consolidated quite a bit since the end of the Cold War. When you think about the average U.S. spend on defense during the Cold War years, 1949 through 1991, it was 7.63% of GDP was the average. We're at something like 3.4%. With inflation, it's probably a lot lower than that in terms of actual purchasing power. So, at that time we were facing one peer adversary. Now we're facing two non-peer adversaries at the minimum. And so I think that there needs to be a pretty stark discussion in the United States with the public and amongst our policymakers about what are the actual resources that we need in order to rebuild our hard power and sort of add additional credibility to our deterrence. And this same conversation is being had in Europe. And so, there is good news there in terms of where the alliance is on spending. Now you have 2/3 of the NATO members are reaching the 2% of GDP benchmark. Pretty much all of them are spending, hitting the benchmark on equipment. I think maybe one is not, but everybody basically is hitting the 20% benchmark. But now the conversation's almost moving on in terms of, 2%, frankly, really isn't enough. So now I think when you look at the countries which have a land border with Russia, they're moving well beyond 2%. They're moving to 4%. And so I think that the conversation really has moved up beyond 2%. This is a good thing, I think, in terms of a potential second Trump administration, because it is, I think, a significant barrier which has been removed in terms of that relationship. But now I think it's about really sort of the nuts and bolts about how do you rebuild your defense industrial capacity, getting those long-term contracts, getting the workforce to work in these industries, to sort of show that commitment, I think, to the Russians that the West is in it for the long haul. And I think that this is going to be a pretty significant challenge that we're going to face. The final piece that I would touch upon is the hybrid or gray zone aggressions. My view is that the West probably is already at war with the Russians. It's more of a simmering war or a shadow war. It's not sort of an active, I would say it's active, but it's not sort of a hot, full-scale war. But when you look at the sort of thing that the Russians have been doing now for the past decade, and it's really ramping up significantly, targeted assassinations for a while it was Russian dissidents, but now you're even seeing plots against, for instance, the CEO of Rheinmetall, the German defense manufacturer, targeting of U.S. diplomats consistently overseas with pulse attacks, cyber attacks, sabotage against warehouses, against infrastructure like rail and ports. There was just a story which broke this week that there was a parcel bomb intended for a DHL plane, a cargo plane in Germany, that erupted on the tarmac. It caught fire on the tarmac, thankfully, rather than in air, just because the plane had a delay. But this sort of thing is going on and on and on. The Russians are actively mapping with drones the sea and land of our allies in the Nordics and in the Baltics. GPS jamming. The list goes on and on and on. And so it's a real, I think, difficult position that the West is in terms of trying to respond to these attacks, to get them to stop and send a message to the Russians, but trying to do it in a way that you don't sort of escalate the current conflict. But I sense that the Russians feel that they have been given somewhat carte blanche in terms of their ability to sort of press forward on this. And so I think that we're seeing the numbers of attacks and their recklessness increase over the past decade. And so, trying to figure out a way to respond to that gray zone aggression was something which was discussed at the Washington summit over the summer. And I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion that's going to be had amongst the alliance members. So what do I anticipate in terms of where NATO is? NATO is trying to sort of bolster itself in terms of its ability to function outside of the United States. And so that's why you had, for instance, the Ukraine Contact Group, the mechanism where aid is going to Ukraine being put in as now it's a NATO mission as opposed to sort of a US-led one. The Europeans are announcing, some of them have announced additional aid packages this week, led by the Germans, to Ukraine. So there are new mechanisms. The French defense manufacturers are now talking about setting up some operations, I think, inside Ukraine. So they're trying to sort of figure out a way to continue on without U.S. leadership. I think it'll be extremely difficult, but I think that there is an effort to try to move it in that direction in terms of where the U.S. could end up in the next few years. I think my best guess is that under a President Harris, I think you have very similar policy you have under President Biden. I think that the war will continue to sort of grind on and on and on, and it's going to be really a test of resources and willpower in terms of who can acquit and who's going to break between the Russians and the Ukrainians first. A lot more scope for, I think, potential possibilities under a second Trump administration. I don't completely discount the possibility that the U.S. Disengages entirely from NATO, doesn't see it as its problem anymore. I think that would be largely catastrophic to U.S. interests, but I don't think that's a non-possibility. But I also don't think there's a possibility that the U.S. Ends up somewhere as it did in the first Trump administration, where the rhetoric is pretty bad, but what happens on the ground in terms of U.S. commitment and U.S. defense spending is actually a little bit better. So there's a bit more of a scope for possibility there, but I think leave it at that and leave some more time for Dr. Weaver and for questions after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. A really fascinating overview, and it sounded realistic in political terms as well. Or maybe I should say hopeful in political terms. Professor Weaver, Dr. Weaver, you might want to comment on this, but otherwise, I do want to ask you to tell us whether some of the criticism of NATO from former President Trump and others is justified. What should be done? What should happen in response? Should the U.S. relationship with NATO be redefined?
As Roy said, I'm going to cover what the U.S. Should consider, regardless of who is elected in November and seated in power in January. The agenda that I'm going to follow is listed here. I intend to cover just a couple minutes dealing with the first two main bullet items, and then I'm going to get into the real meat with the last 3 points, while circling back to things like the articles under the North Atlantic Treaty, as well as the military and civilian structure of the alliance, and which are most applicable to helping advance the U.S. policies. All right. Just a brief history. It was established in 1949 with 12 original members. A lot of people believe that it's purely a military alliance, but that's not the case. It's similar to the United States, where it's got a political structure that provides clear oversight to the military components, and it is headed by a Secretary General, and each country that is a member of NATO actually has an ambassador that represents their nation in the North Atlantic Council, and we can cover that in more details in the subsequent slide. I'd like to underscore that the most important article within the treaty is known as Article 5, which is an armed attack when one is considered an attack on all. And as Roy mentioned, the alliance has been alive for 75 years. The only time that Article 5 has been invoked was during the 9/11 attacks, when the alliance actually soon thereafter provided airborne warning and control systems from Geilenkirchen Air Base, providing air support over the U.S., looking for potential threats that would be seen in the air. That stated, there are other prominent articles. Articles 1 and 2 obviously precede Article 5 and really focus on peace and the importance of diplomatic and efforts in order to engage with other countries to hopefully prevent the onset of conflicts. Article 10 looks to allow the alliance to expand, and it has been used several times over the last several years to expand from the original 12 countries to 32, where we have it today. And as Roy mentioned, Finland and Sweden are the newest two to join the alliance. Article 12 basically says that the alliance can revisit the treaty, and we can kind of circle back to this to include the territory and focus of the alliance. So this might be a potential that the U.S. Can look at, and as Daniel covered with pacing threats of China, perhaps looking to expand beyond the European and North American area of responsibility. And then Article 13, if you look at, as Daniel mentioned, the possibility that former President Trump might look to pull the U.S. out of NATO, the U.S. would do so under Article 13, which basically states that if you give at least a year notification to leave, that after that year, a country could withdraw from the alliance. But I'd like to underscore that in its 75-year history, no nation that has joined the alliance has ever withdrawn from it. Also looking at some basic operations, or some more of the recent operations, the first three that you see listed before you actually focus on NATO's area of responsibility, with Kosovo and the Baltic Air Police mission being ongoing, and these have been occurring throughout the 1990s to present. And there is a precedent for NATO being involved in operations well beyond its border. These include Afghanistan from 2003 until 2021, Libya in 2011, as well as some non-traditional operations and looking at counter piracy, especially off the coast of Africa in the last couple decades as well. Moving on, I want to kind of underscore some of the key points of the NATO structure. So as I mentioned, politically, it provides oversight to military operations. The NATO headquarters under the North Atlantic Council has a NATO Secretary General. Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, ascended to power on October 1st, so just a couple of weeks ago. He took the helm of NATO from Jens Stoltenberg, who had overseen the alliance for the last 10 years. And then we've got some key components here that I'll circle back to in the subsequent slides as we look to push the alliance to basically move things forward to foster U.S. initiatives. And these include the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division, which looks at the possibility of expanding into other operations, provided that the ambassadors in the North Atlantic Council approve of these. The Operations Division, looking at oversight of current NATO operations. The Innovations, Hybrid, and Cyber Division kind of underscores a lot of what Daniel already spoke to with gray zone threats and dealing with hybrid warfare, and we can focus on this in a couple slides down the way. The Defense Policy and Planning Division looks at logistics integration and resilience for the alliance. The Defense Investment Division looks at standards and codification throughout the alliance. The Public Diplomacy Division looks at public affairs. The Executive Management focuses on archival information for the alliance. And then finally, the Joint Intelligence and Security Division looks at the counterintelligence component to protect the political headquarters from foreign intelligence services that would like to gather information on what the alliance is doing and what it's focused on. We'll segue now into the military structure, and there's more to it than this, but just to kind of separate into two main components, we have Allied Command Operations. This is oftentimes referred to by its former name, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. This headquarters has been around since the duration of NATO, and it has always been led by a U.S. four-star that is also dual-hatted as the U.S. European commander. Under this, ACO is responsible for something called the NATO Response Force Construct, which looks at a deployable capability to project power and influence to conduct NATO operations if and when called to do so. And these are basically tasked out to the three joint forces commands that you see listed just below and on the left. So JFC Brunsum is located in the Netherlands. Joint Force Command Naples is located in Italy, with Joint Force Command Norfolk here in the United States. The former two are centered on the integration of air, ground, maritime, and space operations, and the conduct of those, with JFC Norfolk predominantly focusing on maritime operations and the Atlantic Ocean. We have the JSEC, or just bear with me, the Joint Support and Enabling Command, that looks at logistics integration to those operations. Then we've got MARCOM, AIRCOM, and LANDCOM, which look at the functional issues of naval capabilities, air assets, as well as ground-based battalions, et cetera. And then we've got the NATO CIS group, which looks at the integration of what we call C4ISR, command and control, computers and communications, intelligence and surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that are used by the alliance. Again, ACO looks predominantly at real-world operations. ACT conversely looks at providing a trained and ready force in order for the commander of ACO to employ them through the NATO Response Force construct, with the Joint Warfare Center being the primary nexus responsible for conducting those certification exercises. The NATO Training Group is responsible for providing battle staff training for nations within NATO that want to take the lead for various operations, mostly for ongoing operations like we presently see with Kosovo and like we did see with Afghanistan over the last several years. The Joint Forces Training Command is what their combat training center is, similar to what the U.S. has here in the United States with the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert and the Joint Readiness Center in Louisiana, looking at the kinetic side and practicing war games with those units that would actually conduct the shooting if necessary. The NATO school in Oberammergau, Germany, is designed to help train staff officers that will be working in the NATO headquarters. And the Joint Assessment Lessons Learned Center takes the things that have gone well and things that haven't with regard to real-world operations under ACO, as well as exercises under ACT, to see what NATO can build upon in order to do better in the future. In order to see where the U.S. can go forward, I think it's important to have a grounding in some of the key strategic documents that the U.S. uses. I want to underscore a couple key points here. One is that these documents will most likely remain in effect for probably the better part of a year, regardless of who is elected in office and put in power in January, because it usually takes an administration about a year to come up with subsequent versions of these documents. And two, of these, the primary threats around the world are, number one, China, followed by two, Russia, followed by three, cyber. And then there are others, but those are the three primary focal points coming out of the U.S. National Security Strategy at the bottom left, which is prepared by, with the direction of the president and through the National Security Council with input from the Secretaries of Homeland Security, State, and Defense. And then as we move from left to right, we've got the strategic plans of Homeland Security, Defense, and State, which basically pull out of the NSS and look to see how their specific departments can contribute to those efforts to advance U.S. security. And then this all stems from, at the unclassified level, the annual threat assessment in the bottom right, as well as at the classified level, the national intelligence estimates, which basically help us understand what the threats are on the global stage. What do I think the U.S. can do? The six main points that I think the U.S. Can leverage through NATO are listed here, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these. The first one deals with the adaptation to hybrid threats. And as Daniel already mentioned, we need to understand that other countries can neither directly confront the US, nor can they deal directly with NATO's military and win at this time. So they're going to use asymmetric tactics, techniques, and procedures in order to try to weaken the US and NATO. So we need to understand this, and the US should engage with NATO specifically through, once again, looking at the political headquarters with the Innovations Hybrid Cyber Division, as well as ACO, in order to make sure that we are prepared to deal with these types of threats. So, for example, the paramilitary operators that Russia has used in Ukraine under what was formerly known as the Wagner Group, and they've also used these elsewhere around the world, in Syria as well as in Africa. And we need to understand that this will probably likely continue, as well as their use of information operations and malign information campaigns and disinformation campaigns to weaken the legitimacy of both the United States and NATO. Nevertheless, we need to still keep a strategic focus and encourage NATO to maintain a strategic focus. So whereas the US became so myopically focused on terrorism in the decade and a half following the terrorist attacks, that we failed to see rising powers like China and like Russia. So we can't take our eye off of other things while we look at adaptation to hybrid threats. And we need to also remain flexible, and the alliance needs to remain flexible in order to understand that the adversaries will change their TTPs based on how the US and NATO are dealing with these particular issues. Secondly, it needs to invest in modernization of the force. So as Daniel covered, 23 of the 32 countries are contributing 2% of their GDP towards defensive spending. But nevertheless, the US needs to continue to press NATO, especially as it moves forward with its 4x30 initiative, where it is looking to have 30 ships, 30 deployable air squadrons, and 30 deployable ground-based battalions to be deployed anywhere in the world within 30 days under the NATO response force construct. So pushing those 9 other countries in order to do more and contribute at least 2% of their GDP, as well as investing in these new deployable capabilities. Again, by looking at sharing the cost, the US can help save the taxpayers some money by having other countries use and spend their money on these things as well, all while enhancing those capabilities. And again, this really focuses on ACO and its initiatives, as well as ACT, in looking to test and train on these capabilities. Next, we also need to invest in cyber network defense to understand that both the United States and the alliance more broadly are heavily reliant on technology as a way to integrate our weapon systems, as well as our C4ISR networks, and to ensure resiliency and layered defenses to protect them from adversaries that might want to exploit these weaknesses, as well as looking at what other countries might be doing with their disinformation campaigns to undermine the US as well as NATO. And again, going back to the Innovation, Hybrid, and Cyber Division at NATO headquarters, as well as efforts through practicing with ACT and the Joint Warfare Center, as well as NATO keeping its eye on what's going on with regard to this in real-world operations under ACO. We need to make sure that we continue to invest in C&D efforts going forward. Next, improving rapid deployable capabilities. So presently, NATO is involved in and has forces forwardly deployed in the countries of Bulgaria, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. But it is not enough to serve as a deterrent to Russia if it decides to move beyond Ukraine into the eastern part of Europe. So we need to continue to invest in the very high joint task force capability to have a deployable headquarters within 2 to 3 days, as well as 20,000 initial forces moving forward to up to 40,000 forces within 30 days. And then again, as NATO moves towards 2030 with that 4x30 initiative to make sure that we've got these capabilities to provide a formidable challenge to anybody that might want to hedge against NATO or influence NATO or the United States, all under this NATO response force construct under ACO. We need to do this while keeping the alliance together. We need to speak with one voice. If the U.S. decides to stay in NATO and not withdraw under Article 13, we need to see that neither NATO nor the U.S. undermines one or the other, and we can kind of talk about some of the missteps that were taken by the Biden administration leading up to the war in Ukraine during our question and answer period to maintain a unified front and hopefully even expanding on this like we saw in Afghanistan, where we had 14 additional countries that were involved alongside the United States in this effort beyond just the normal and traditional NATO countries, all while maintaining and keeping public support, especially looking at the public affairs component to the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And in order to do this, NATO needs to get out of its comfort zone and conduct warfighting exercises outside of the border. You know, I was privileged enough to participate in one of these exercises in 2006 when we deployed a NATO headquarters and the full accoutrement of ground, air, and maritime assets to the country of Cape Verde off the west coast of Senegal and Africa to actually test our capabilities in an austere environment. We need to continue to do this, again, moving beyond the purview of the European area of responsibility, all while preparing for non-traditional security threats. As I get ready to conclude, I just want to say that if the U.S. decides to stay in the alliance, and I hope it does, that there is value in sharing the cost of these operations. Not that the U.S. couldn't do things alone. It can, and it has done unilateral operations like we saw basically in Iraq in 2003. But nevertheless, if we can have other countries join us and share that cost, that can be a good thing and help save our taxpayers some money, and all while also helping maintain legitimacy. If we have more countries standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States regarding future threats, to include those of China and others out of the area, like North Korea, like Iran, there's a greater testament to having this legitimacy rather than just the U.S. trying to do this on its own. So thanks for listening. That concludes my part of the presentation. Well, I'll turn it back over to you for, I guess, questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Professor. That covers the waterfront. It's certainly very impressive on paper, but I think it's also impressive in reality, and not just on paper. So we have a couple of questions here about Article 13, which is the article for leaving NATO. Robbie Harris, the chairman of our board of trustees, asks whether the Senate would have to approve withdrawal. And another member, Kermit Harrison, asks whether Article 13 was used once before when France left NATO in the 1960s. Was it or was it the 50s? I can't remember. Was that under Article 13?
Well, I'll answer the second one. Daniel, I don't know if you have an answer on the U.S. Senate. I just know that procedurally that the U.S. would basically have to notify itself as a depository nation and then notify the other countries. But getting back to France, France just left the military structure. It never left the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I think it wasn't until maybe 2008, 7, 8 that it rejoined the military structure, but it never left. It never left the alliance. It just that actually caused us to have to move the strategic headquarters that was then shaped from France to where it is now in Brussels, Belgium. But it never really left NATO. So I don't know, Daniel, do you have any information on the Senate's role with regard to whether or not the president could unilaterally do this, or if he would have to work through the Senate?
Well, my understanding is that there was recent legislation which was passed through an NDAA which would block a future U.S. president from unilaterally exiting NATO. So that I'm sure was done with the possibility of President Trump returning. The question I think becomes in practice, how does that work out? It's been, the Senate has never been able to stop a president from leaving a treaty in the past. And so you think about a situation where the U.S. is still a NATO member, but a NATO member in name only, where you have the president not taking part, not sending an ambassador to NATO, not taking part in NATO missions or training, and so it sort of becomes a fait accompli regardless. But I think that the Senate is in a stronger position legally in terms of if there was a move to do so without their advice and consent, there could be legal challenges, which I think would put them in a better position now. But how long that would take to play out and what the reality on the ground would be, I think is a bit of another question.
So, building on that, and coming back to your earlier remarks, Daniel, there's clearly a division in the Republican Party now. At least two factions on this issue. Who do you identify in each faction? Because it seems to me in the event of a Trump administration, you'd want to look and see who is being appointed. I think you made that very point. So who should we be watching out for? Who's leading each faction?
It's a really strange thing, Roy. You're right. I mean, I think my view is that in the Republican side, this has largely been sort of an elite-driven phenomenon. 2/3 of Americans still see NATO as beneficial to the United States, including the majority of Republicans. And now that's Republicans overall. But there's obviously, I think, a more isolationist faction, which I still think is the minority, but it's a very vocal minority, and a more traditional, if you want to call that conservative wing, which is more open to engagement overseas. I think, look, I think Vance is a bit of a wild card. He's changed his stripes a few times, so I don't necessarily know how much you can sort of pin him. And I think, in terms of the sort of globally engaged Republican side, I mean, people like Nikki Haley, of course, Mike Pompeo, Tom Cotton. I mean, these sorts of individuals, I think, are who you would sort of expect from that side. From the more isolationist wing, I think that you have people like Mike Lee, Rand Paul in the Senate. Much less likely to be engaged there. I think in the House there's a wider majority. I mean, obviously you have people all the way from Marjorie Taylor Greene on the sort of extremes. Speaker Johnson, I think, is probably somewhere in the middle in terms of where he would fall out. But I think that by and large, it would be I'm very curious to see who ends up at state, who ends up at DOD, and who ends up at National Security Council in terms of kind of reading the tea leaves in terms of where the Trump administration would go. I don't see the former president, is particularly ideological on this point. I think that he's willing to sort of be persuaded at some level, although he does seem to have a fixation, I think, on some elements of the relationship. But I don't think it's a completely lost cause.
So Paul Morell, a member, asks a question about the military leaders, and he mentions Mattis, Milley, and Esper, I think, who have all broken with President Trump. So how confident could you be in a second Trump administration that that the military will produce its very best people? These are certainly all distinguished people. When there seems to be a significant break with those who have been at the very top.
Well, I'll just I lead us off with this. The degree I was actually very impressed with former President Trump when he was in office, when he surrounded himself with John Kellys and Jim Mattis's, et cetera. I was actually, as a former military officer, I was comforted that he was seemingly surrounding himself with very smart people. It subsequently has come out that, I'm sorry?
Until they left.
Until they left. And they were very candid and very direct with their advice to Trump. They weren't ones to kowtow and equivocate when President Trump was trying to push them on particular issues to get them to go a certain way. That said, the degree to which any president decides on who is going to occupy these key positions, and their intellect to deal with actually addressing the issues that are required of them, and to be able to speak candidly to the president is of paramount concern. If somebody is going to essentially appoint yes people into these positions that don't have the intestinal fortitude to push back when a leader is making a bad decision, then that could be a recipe for disaster. And I guess I'll just leave it at that, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel, see if he wants to add any comments to that.
I think that's a great point, Dr. Weaver. And, one of the, I think, other interesting phenomena to watch for either president is going to be that there's been a significant turnover in terms of leadership in Europe. So you have sort of country interest in how countries interact with each other, but so much of NATO is like every human relationship. It's about people at top, whether or not they like each other, whether or not they can work together. And so you think there's a new government in the UK. It's a Labour government. There's a new government in Poland fairly recently. There's obviously a new government in Italy with Giorgia Meloni. And I very much suspect that in a year's time, there'll be new governments in Canada and Germany as well. So and of course, as Dr. Weaver mentioned, there's a new Secretary General now for the first time in a decade. So there's quite a significant, I think, turnover in terms of leadership amongst the rest of NATO. So it'll be really interesting, I think, to see how those personalities play out with either of the two potential U.S. presidents, because a lot of the sort of old hands, when you think about the first Trump administration with Merkel and David Cameron early on and Stoltenberg, I mean, all these people now have moved on. So it's an obviously different government in Warsaw. So it's a very different, I think, picture in many ways. There, some characters still around, like Erdogan, but there is quite a bit of turnover as well, which would be interesting to see how that plays out.
By the way, speaking of Erdogan, we had a question from Otis Sproul. Do you consider Turkey to be a stabilizing or destabilizing factor in NATO today?
I can, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a unique individual. I think he tries to use his position in NATO in order to get something out of the alliance. So a lot of what he does, he's trying to get something from the alliance in exchange for his support. I wouldn't see him as much of a destabilizing factor as I would Viktor Orban in Hungary. I'm more concerned with him than Turkey. But nevertheless, I've seen, just from personal experience, Turkey kind of exert itself in the past, especially when there were some issues with us wanting to provide them with an air defense capability, and then Turkey opting to try to get our attention by going after a Russian air defense system. So he has used his influence and his behavior in order to try and get something out of NATO and the member countries.
We have a question from David Sliney asking whether we're focusing too much on the Republican reaction to NATO and Trump's reaction. and he asks, what about the Democratic left who have expressed concerns about the military-industrial complex? Well, actually, I think that phrase came from Eisenhower, didn't it? Um, but certainly there are people on the left in the Democratic Party who want to cut defense spending in favor of social needs. Is that a significant group? Do they are they likely to influence policy?
Well, I think it's a fair question to ask. I mean, my assessment is that you're much more likely to have a robust U.S. defense budget under Republican President Trump than you would under a Harris administration. I mean, the Biden administration has consistently sent de facto cuts to Congress in terms of their defense budgets, which have been topped up over the last few years. But I think by and large, there's more of an interest in funding domestic priorities than there is in terms of investing in the defense side of things. And so I think that this is one area where there is potentially positive news from a second Trump administration. I think there's going to be more willingness, at least to send Congress budgets, which are increases in defense spending. I think that some of these same dynamics would probably also rear their heads in terms of Ukraine. There is a contingent amongst the American left, which is also opposed to U.S. Engagement in a lot of different regions for different ideological reasons. But they've, I think, largely been kept under wraps because of the current administration. I think you would see a bit more of those cracks in a Trump administration, a more vocal minority amongst the Democrats would be making some of the same arguments I think that you're hearing from the sort of right side of the Republican spectrum. I think that I think it depends. I think in Ukraine, I think that they're probably a bit quieter. I think the bigger issue is probably in terms of Iran and in terms of Israel. And so the Middle East picture, I think, is more complicated in terms of the left in the U.S. being less interested in U.S. engagement than Iran. But I do think that those elements are there as well.
Dean Ertwein, and he's a member of our Board of Trustees, has the admission of Finland and Sweden changed the dynamic between NATO and Russia? Very interesting question.
I don't know if it's necessarily changed things, though. Both do bring formidable capabilities to the alliance, especially with regard to air capabilities. But I think it does concern Russia that we're basically encroaching on the southern flank with now two additional countries that were kind of on the fence. I mean, they had participated in NATO exercises in the past, but they hadn't really officially been part of the alliance. But I think it does give Russia cause for concern that two countries that were for years not willing to sign on with NATO have actually made that commitment and done so at this point.
Who's in the waiting room now to join NATO, and should they be admitted sooner than later? I mean, obviously Ukraine wishes to be in, but I'm thinking of Moldova or Georgia. Should NATO be a little bit faster on these cases?
Well, I mean, you have some aspirant countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia. I think that is obviously a very difficult country these days in terms of where the Georgian government has taken the country in recent years. The Balkans, of course, also similarly very difficult in terms of getting up to NATO standards to be able to join the alliance. So I don't see a huge push to expand NATO right now. I think it's important for NATO to at least rhetorically be supportive of the open door policy that Russia doesn't have a check or a veto on future expansion of the alliance. But I think the reality is it's probably pretty unlikely that the alliance expands anytime soon because of the difficulties of some of the different aspirant countries, and also because if Ukraine is not the next country to join NATO, I think that there's a real question there in terms of the relationship between NATO and Ukraine. But as you know, it is striking, I think, that as Dr. Weaver was talking about, you think about Sweden and Finland, these are two countries where it was a social democrat government in both cases, which brought these countries into the alliance. And these typically were the sides of the government which were a little more hesitant to engage with NATO with overwhelming, I think, majorities in both of these countries. So that tells you a lot, I think, about the security picture and about the way that Europeans are viewing their own security. And there are some ancillary benefits to the Baltics in terms of being able to reinforce and secure them a bit with having these countries in the alliance. But it's a significant shift, but I don't see a huge push to expand anytime soon coming from NATO.
Robbie Harris, you had a question about finances of NATO financing.
I do, and thank you, Roy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I guess where to start? First, let me point out that I am a retired Navy guy and have had a good bit of very positive experience with NATO. And I'm guessing that John and Daniel are similar. Our NATO officers live very, very nicely. So let me begin with this. There was an article either yesterday or the day before, I think in the Wall Street Journal, indicating that Trump was going to call on NATO to commit to 3% of GDP rather than 2%. And it was an accompanying piece from the Congressional Budget Office that said we, the U.S., would be very, very challenged in the next 5 years to meet the 3% rule, given inflation. That's data point one. Number one, the challenge to NATO for a 3% match when we would be challenged to do that. And then I saw the slide about the various NATO commands. And again, I'll go back to my experience with NATO, which I've loved very, very much. But they live very, very well. And there is a lot of infrastructure there. And I remember, was it 2018 when then President Trump went to the NATO leaders meeting in Brussels, and he was overwhelmed by the new headquarters. And you can imagine how much that new headquarters cost and all the infrastructure cost with it. But then a follow-on slide, you showed the various U.S. security strategies. There is the defense strategy. There's the president's strategy. There's an intelligence strategy. And it goes on and on. So there's lots of infrastructure costs on our side as well. So I just wonder, isn't there a lot of room for economizing both in terms of NATO and the U.S.?
Well, I'll just speak to, I guess, a little bit of it. I was the last 6 years of my Army career, I was a NATO staff officer at the Allied Joint Force Command Brunswick headquarters. So I lived in one of those headquarters for 6 years. Yes, you're right. There is a lot of plushness to the headquarters, but at the same time, in my 6 years there, I did 5 deployments to Afghanistan, and I can assure you that I was not sleeping in any plush accommodations there. I deployed to Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and these were some of the more austere environments. So it's not
but you were one of a small minority that deployed. The others, correct me if I'm wrong, and listen, I love NATO, but the others remained in Brussels and they lived very, very nicely.
Yes. I mean, when I was back in Europe, it was comfortable, but I wouldn't say it was any more comfortable than any U.S. headquarters that I worked at. I've been to the new NATO headquarters, and yes, it is quite plush. Having been to ACO, having been to ACT, having been to the brand new NATO headquarters, if you go to what is now referred to, well, what used to be referred to as SHAPE, that's a pretty rundown facility. Norfolk's facility is nicer. Brunsum is kind of in the middle. So they're not all super plush. None of them have air conditioning except maybe the one in Norfolk. And it's still
and the one in Norfolk has an especially good package store.
Okay, sure. As all of them do too. I can attest to that. But the nations still provide the salaries for the people that work in those headquarters, and the nations also provide the housing allowance for the individuals that work in those headquarters. So it's not that the U.S. or Albania or the UK or whoever is giving this money to NATO to dole out to the people that work in those headquarters. Those per diems, those cost of living allowances, those salaries, that's all paid for by the nation. So, we might want to take an introspective look as to how the money is being allocated. What can be called into question is the money that is provided to NATO for infrastructure projects, to see if maybe we could dial that back. But I still would submit to you that, when you look at that compared to, like, for example, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which has under-delivered on capabilities and over-delivered on cost, we probably spent a lot more money on a plane that has significantly underperformed than we have with all of the NATO headquarters combined. But Daniel's, I know he's done weapons assessments and has expertise on that. Perhaps he could comment on that. But that's just my 2 cents on the kind of the plushness of these NATO headquarters.
Point well made.
Yes. Yes, Daniel, let me just throw in a final question here from Bishop Aubrey Harley, also from our board. How does the United States handle the hybrid warfare issue when these attacks often have to do with free expression and, in a sense, freedom of speech? Are these attacks at the level that they are really dangerous? And Daniel, I'll also give you the last word on in relation to NATO expenditures.
Well, I think on the NATO expenditure front, I would just add that I do think that this is where the conversation is going. I think the US is probably somewhere around 2.7% with inflation, so I think 3% is going to be very difficult for us to hit as well. But I think the reality is that the 2% is not enough, and so you're having countries on their own making this assessment that what they need is to go upwards of 3% in order to rebuild their capabilities. And so this, in a second Trump administration, this could be really the conversation, I think, around those members who are willing to commit to 3% and those who are sort of stuck lower at 2%. I think the hybrid attacks, absolutely. I think there's so many incidents, I think, where a shopping mall in Warsaw, which was set aflame. There was a plot to set on fire an IKEA in Lithuania, assassinations at distance. I mean, you think about the chemical attack in the UK, which obviously had some civilians which were hurt in that because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Attacks against critical infrastructure, water systems. So these are I think plots, many of them which have real consequences in terms of life and death. And so I see them as extremely serious. I mean, just one more example, these GPS attacks, which have really blanketed the alliance from northern Norway down through Bulgaria. Civilian airliners have redundancy systems, but you could see a situation where a crew which isn't quite as trained loses awareness in nighttime flight, and you have a tragedy in terms of GPS tracking. So there are, I think, a number of areas where there's real room for concern. And we didn't even touch on, I think, the ghost fleet that the Russians are using to move their oil. these are really unsafe ships, and you could have, I think, a potential environmental disaster on our hands if the worst should happen there. So I do think that these are particularly serious. The first thing you have to do is attribution. You have to make clear to the Russians that you know that it's them who's doing this. A lot of this is being launched via sabotage from people inside the country, so you can kind of know who those either Russians or criminal networks are. You can try to target them, but it is difficult to kind of calibrate a response for each individual instance of brazen aggression, which is effective. And so I think that's the real challenge that NATO is going to be facing in the times moving forward.
Well, thank you very much. And I should ask Professor Weaver, did you have a last word you'd like to make?
Yeah, having spent time in NATO, the U.S. is not going to get exactly what it wants out of the alliance. But it's kind of like buying a new car versus a used car. You can buy a new car and spend a lot of money and get exactly what you want, but you're going to spend a lot of money. Or you can buy a used car and you get a lot of the things that you want, but there's going to be some issues and problems probably with that vehicle. So, if you want to look at sharing cost and if you want to look at legitimacy, then I think there is value added with the U.S. trying to push NATO to advance and make changes that might be aligned with our strategic direction and priorities moving forward. But if we decide to buy the new car, understand that there's going to be a significant increase in the amount of cost to what it's going to translate to the American taxpayers if we decide to invoke Article 13 and pull out of the alliance.
I think it would be a very expensive new car, as you say. Well, listen, I want to thank the two of you for excellent presentations and answers to questions. And I think we've covered almost every question of our audience. It was excellent. Thank you really so much tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure.